Welcome to InfoStream, your daily current. Unsure what to listen to? Turn to us for today's headlines. Stay informed. Trump's influence is key to U.S. efforts to end the Ukraine war. Europe maintains a firm stance on peace talks amidst the ongoing conflict. U.S. pressure on Venezuela stems from oil concerns, according to the Colombian president. The U.S. Navy has canceled the Constellation Frigate program. A coup occurred in Guinea-Bissau following a presidential arrest. Israel has identified one returned hostage, with two still held in Gaza. A U.S. teenager, Zaher Ibrahim Mohammed, is facing a court appearance after detention without charge. Wagner is accused of atrocities and human rights abuses in Mali. Jair Bolsonaro begins serving a 27-year prison sentence in Brazil. The U.S. is implementing a new America First global health strategy, facing criticism. Canada is navigating a delicate trade war with the United States. A diplomatic row has arisen over passenger detention in China. The EU has upheld the recognition of same-sex marriages across the bloc. Disagreements exist between the US and EU regarding a peace proposal for Ukraine. Rare earth mining contributes to pollution and conflict in the Mekong River Basin. Trump's drone guy central to US effort to end Ukraine war. Recent reporting highlights Army Secretary Dan Driscoll's increasingly central role in the United States' diplomatic efforts to resolve the conflict in Ukraine, largely due to his close ties to Vice President J.D. Vance and President Donald Trump. Driscoll, nicknamed the drone guy due to his extensive work on developing new drone technology for the Army, was unexpectedly tasked by Trump to push for a peace agreement between Ukraine and Russia. Leveraging his existing relationships with key figures within the administration, the assignment underscores Trump's unconventional approach to international crisis, utilizing individuals with whom he has business or personal connections to lead negotiations, rather than relying solely on established diplomatic channels. Driscoll's rapid engagement, facilitated through communication with Vance and Steve Witkoff, a longtime business associate, has enabled a swift, albeit contentious, diplomatic blitz across three countries. The core of Driscoll's mission involves reshaping the U.S.'s strategy for engaging with Russia, aiming to secure a peace agreement that aligns with Trump's maximalist positions. The initial 28-point proposal, heavily weighted towards Moscow's interests, was subsequently revised following discussions with Ukrainian officials and Secretary of State Marco Rubio in Geneva. Despite his central role, Driscoll's lack of prior diplomatic experience has raised concerns, particularly regarding his ability to navigate the complexities of dealing with Russia. However, his trusted position within Trump's inner circle and his established relationships provide a unique advantage. Furthermore, Driscoll's involvement reflects a strategic shift within the administration, potentially replacing Secretary of Defense Pete Hegseth, who has faced criticism for his handling of the Ukraine conflict and strained relationships with Ukrainian officials. Driscoll's rapid engagement, facilitated through communication with Vance and Witkoff, has enabled a swift, albeit contentious, diplomatic blitz across three countries. The situation underscores the evolving dynamics within the Trump administration and the unconventional strategies employed to address global crisis. Driscoll's central role highlights a willingness to utilize personal connections and prioritize achieving desired outcomes, even if it deviates from traditional diplomatic protocols. Europe's position on peace talks remains firm amidst ongoing conflict in Ukraine. Recent developments surrounding the war in Ukraine reveal a significant lack of genuine intent from Russia to engage in meaningful peace negotiations, according to European Commission President Ursula von der Leyen. Speaking before the European Parliament in Strasbourg, von der Leyen characterized the situation as volatile and dangerous, directly accusing Moscow of lacking a sincere desire for a resolution. This assessment follows statements from Kremlin spokesperson Dmitry Peskov, who deemed discussions about a peace deal premature. Despite ongoing diplomatic efforts, including talks in Geneva and Abu Dhabi, Ukraine has revised an initial 28-point peace plan, significantly altered to address criticisms of its pro-Russian bias. Ukrainian President Zelensky acknowledged this revised draft as representing the right approach, though substantial disagreements with Russia persist. Von der Leyen emphasized Europe's unwavering commitment to supporting Ukraine, stating that the continent would continue to provide robust security guarantees aimed at deterring further Russian aggression. The issue of frozen Russian assets, totaling $210 billion held within European financial institutions, also remained a central point of contention, particularly due to Belgium's opposition to utilizing these funds to aid Ukraine, citing potential legal ramifications. However, von der Leyen attempted to mitigate concerns regarding the potential burden on European taxpayers asserting she did not foresee a scenario where European citizens would ultimately bear the cost of repaying these assets. The persistent disagreements highlight the complex and challenging nature of achieving a lasting peace agreement, with Russia continuing to demonstrate a reluctance to compromise and Europe steadfastly supporting Ukraine's sovereignty and security. The situation remains precarious, demanding continued diplomatic engagement and resolute support for the Ukrainian people. U.S. pressure on Venezuela driven by oil claims Colombian President Petro. Colombian President Gustavo Petro has asserted that U.S. pressure on Venezuela is primarily motivated by access to the country's substantial oil reserves, rather than a genuine effort to combat drug trafficking or promote democracy. Petro's statements, delivered in an exclusive CNN interview, stem from escalating U.S. military activity in the Caribbean and Pacific, intensifying tensions between the two nations. He argues that President Donald Trump's logic centers on securing Venezuela's oil resources. Petro has been a vocal critic of the Trump administration, frequently challenging its policies on immigration, Israel, and military interventions in Latin America. The U.S. State Department responded to Petro's accusations, maintaining its commitment to counter drug operations and protecting Americans from the alleged deadly poison of the Maduro regime. The dispute extends beyond diplomatic disagreements, with the U.S. Treasury sanctioning Petro in October, accusing him of involvement in the global illicit drug trade, a claim Petro vehemently denies. Despite seizing more cocaine than any other nation, Petro contends that the U.S. administration views him with suspicion, labeling him a subversive thug, due to his past association with the M19 guerrilla movement. Venezuela's government denies accusations of drug trafficking, and UNODC reports indicate that Venezuela is not a cocaine-producing country. The majority of Colombian cocaine is trafficked north along the Pacific coast. Recent reports have surfaced alleging links between Colombian officials and FARC dissidents, highlighting sensitive intelligence shared with armed groups. Despite these tensions, U.S.-Colombia relations remain largely intact, with the Biden administration designating Colombia as a major non-NATO ally. U.S. Secretary of State Marco Rubio has emphasized that the administration's concerns are directed at Petro, not the broader institutions or people of Colombia. The U.S. continues to view Colombia as a key ally in security and defense. Petro acknowledges past ties between officials and drug traffickers, but insists these connections predate his presidency. The U.S. State Department has urged thorough investigations into allegations of corruption and illicit activities. U.S. Navy cancels Constellation frigate program amid shipbuilding challenges. The U.S. Navy has terminated its Constellation-class frigate program, a significant setback in efforts to match China's expanding naval capabilities. Secretary of the Navy John Fillon announced the cancellation, citing the program's failure to deliver value for money and its inability to meet the Navy's warfighting needs. This decision follows a pattern of troubled shipbuilding programs within the Navy, including the widely criticized Littoral Combat Ships (LCS) program, which has faced numerous breakdowns and high costs. The Constellation class, intended as an agile multi-mission warship, was envisioned as a solution to fill a gap between existing destroyers and littoral combat ships. However, modifications proved extensive, leading to ballooning costs and delayed schedules. The program's fate mirrors that of the larger, more ambitious Zumwalt-class destroyers, which were reduced from a planned 32 ships to just 3 due to exorbitant expenses. Currently, the U.S. Navy operates around 2 to 40 ships and submarines, significantly fewer than China's estimated 400 hulls by year-end. The Navy's struggles extend beyond the Constellation class, with the LCS program totaling an estimated $100 billion in costs and frequent operational issues. The Navy is increasingly reliant on overseas shipyards in South Korea and Japan for maintenance, highlighting the challenges in domestic shipbuilding. The cancellation of the Constellation program doesn't represent a complete halt to naval construction. Construction will continue on the second ship in the class, the USS Congress, but its future remains uncertain. Fincantieri Marine Group will transition its workforce to other programs, ensuring continuity for its personnel and shipyards on the Great Lakes. Key concerns revolve around the Navy's design capabilities, with analysts pointing to a lack of effective, problem-free surface warships since the introduction of the Arleigh Burke-class destroyers over 2 decades ago. The Navy's difficulties are not attributed to the shipyards themselves, but rather to the design process. The U.S. is exploring options for utilizing overseas shipyards to maintain naval vessels, contingent on changes to existing laws. The Navy's strategic shift focuses on faster ship construction and delivering capabilities to warfighters more rapidly, prioritizing shipbuilding across multiple shipyards. Guinea-Bissau coup military seizes control following presidential arrest. A coup has unfolded in Guinea-Bissau, with a group of military officers declaring themselves in control after reports surfaced of the arrest of President Umaro Sissoco Embalo. The takeover occurred amidst heightened tensions following a disputed presidential election where both Embalo and his main opponent, Fernando Dias, had claimed victory. Gunshots were heard in the capital city of Bissau around 1300 GMT on Wednesday, prompting widespread panic and a mass exodus of citizens seeking safety. Government sources confirmed Embalo's detention, marking a significant escalation in the country's volatile political landscape. The military officers established the High Military Command for the restoration of order, asserting their authority until further notice. They issued an instruction for the population to maintain calm, attempting to quell the unrest. Guinea-Bissau, a nation of under 2 million people and consistently ranked among the world's poorest, has a deeply troubled history marked by political instability. Since 1980, the country has experienced 9 coups or attempted coups. Notably, Embalo himself has been the target of 2 previous attempts to overthrow him, most recently in December 2023. The disputed election results and the subsequent arrest have exacerbated an already precarious situation, highlighting Guinea-Bissau's vulnerability to military intervention and its struggle for stability. The international community is closely monitoring developments as the High Military Command establishes its rule, and the future of the nation remains uncertain. The country's long-standing issues of poverty and political instability contribute to the ongoing crisis, demanding immediate attention and a path towards a more secure and democratic future. Israel Identifies returned hostage 2 remain in Gaza. Following a ceasefire agreement concluded in October, Israel has officially identified the remains of a deceased Israeli hostage, Dror, returned from Gaza. The Prime Minister's office announced the identification, marking a significant step in the process of recovering the bodies of hostages held by Hamas. The handover occurred through the Red Cross, leaving a total of 2 deceased hostages, an Israeli and a Thai national, still unaccounted for within the Gaza Strip. The October ceasefire facilitated the release of the remaining 251 hostages, both alive and deceased, following the devastating October 7th attacks. 20 hostages were released in mid-October, and now, the identification of Dror represents the culmination of efforts to return the remains of those who perished during the initial assault. Dror, age 48, was killed during the attacks on Kibbutz Be'eri. Initially believed to have been abducted, his family was informed in May 2024 that he had died alongside his wife, Yonat. His body was subsequently taken to Gaza. Dror's name, meaning freedom and light in Hebrew, reflected his character, described by his family as a free spirit spreading strong light around the world. He was a devoted father, working as the chief cheesemaker at the Be'eri Dairy and a yoga teacher. 2 of his children were also abducted and released in November 2023. Despite intelligence assessments suggesting Hamas may not be able to locate and return all remaining deceased hostages, Hamas has continued its search within Gaza. The Hostages and Missing Families Forum has persistently organized rallies across Israel, demanding the release of the remaining deceased hostages. The ongoing efforts highlight the immense emotional toll and the complex challenges surrounding the recovery of the hostages and the resolution of this protracted conflict, with the identification of Dror, representing a crucial milestone. Zaher Ibrahim Mohammed, U.S. teen detained without charge, faces court appearance. A Palestinian-American teenager, Zaher Ibrahim Mohammed, is scheduled to appear in Israeli court after being detained for 9 months without formal charges. Mohammed, 16 and residing in Florida, was arrested in February while on holiday in the Israeli-occupied West Bank, accused of throwing stones at Jewish settlers, a claim he vehemently denies. The detention has prompted significant concern, with 27 Democratic U.S. senators and House members urging the Trump administration to exert greater pressure on Israel to secure his release. The Ibrahim family expresses deep distress, describing Mohammed as a regular, fun kid who enjoys sports and school. He was apprehended during a nighttime raid on his family's holiday home in the Palestinian village of Al-Mazrah al-Sharqiyya. According to the family, he was subjected to coercion and physical abuse during his detention, forced to confess to the charges due to the soldiers' actions. The Israeli government maintains that Mohammed committed a serious, potentially deadly crime. Despite the family's assertions of abuse and the lack of charges, the U.S. Embassy has assigned a caseworker who reports Mohammed's declining health due to weight loss. The family highlights the ineffectiveness of his American passport, noting that it has not provided any assistance in his case. The U.S. State Department acknowledges tracking the case closely and collaborating with the Israeli government, though they are limited in their ability to comment further due to privacy considerations. U.S. Ambassador to Israel Mike Huckabee and embassy staff are reportedly deeply involved. The case underscores concerns about due process and the treatment of Palestinian minors in Israeli detention, highlighting the challenges faced by the family in securing their son's release. The situation remains unresolved as Mohammed prepares to face the Israeli court. Wagner's atrocities and human rights abuses in Mali. The BBC has investigated widespread human rights abuses perpetrated by Russian mercenaries, primarily through the Wagner Group, in Mali. Testimonies, including that of former shopkeeper Ahmed, reveal systematic torture, killings, and intimidation tactics employed during the group's operations. Wagner fighters, initially deployed to assist the Malian junta against Islamist militants, engaged in brutal counter-insurgency measures, often targeting civilians and local populations. Ahmed's harrowing account details his abduction, prolonged torture involving water immersion, beatings, and threats of decapitation, stemming from accusations of collusion with jihadists. He witnessed the systematic targeting of individuals, such as Siko Sisi, a random resident, and the use of intimidation tactics like forcing residents to gather on a football field while searching for a suspect. Wagner's actions created a climate of fear, disrupting the Malian military hierarchy, as highlighted by a Malian official who described the mercenaries as worse than the French. Other refugees, including Yusuf and his friends, recounted similar experiences, including being beaten for no apparent reason, threatened with being thrown into wells, and subjected to prolonged torture while herding cattle near the Mauritanian border. These incidents paint a picture of Wagner's widespread and indiscriminate violence. The investigation reveals that Wagner's operations extended beyond direct combat, encompassing the systematic intimidation and abuse of civilians. The group's actions led to a mass exodus of people seeking refuge in camps like Umbera in Mauritania, where individuals like Bintu and Yusuf shared their traumatic experiences. The European Council on Foreign Relations reported that Wagner shared graphic photos and videos of atrocities, including severed heads and gouged out eyes, within a Telegram channel. The Sentry Campaign Group confirmed Wagner's role in creating chaos and fear. While Escalates noted a decline in extreme atrocities compared to Wagner's operation, the legacy of human rights violations persists, with most of Wagner's fighters now integrated into Africa Corps, inheriting a significant risk of continued abuses. The conflict has displaced nearly 50,000 people, and the situation remains deeply concerning. Brazil's former president Jair Bolsonaro ordered to begin serving a 27-year prison sentence. Jair Bolsonaro has been ordered to begin serving a 27-year and 3-month prison sentence for orchestrating an attempted coup, following his 2022 election defeat to Luiz Inácio Lula da Silva. The Supreme Court, led by Justice Alexandre de Moraes, finalized the conviction, preventing any further appeals. Bolsonaro has been detained since Saturday at Brazil's federal police headquarters after attempting to tamper with his ankle monitor using a soldering iron. Bolsonaro admitted to the tampering, attributing it to medication-induced hallucinations and a lack of intention to flee. The court mandated full-time medical care for him. His defense team initially chose not to file a final appeal, allowing the court to declare the conviction final. The case stemmed from Bolsonaro's efforts to retain power after losing the election. He and co-conspirators mapped out an illegal path to remain president, culminating in the January 8, 2023, attack on government buildings in Brasilia by Bolsonaro supporters. This attack was fueled by Bolsonaro's plan for the military to intervene and restore him to power. Following the attack, Bolsonaro was arrested, and the Supreme Court ruled that he was guilty of plotting a coup. As a consequence, he is barred from running for public office until 2060. Alongside Bolsonaro, other individuals implicated in the conspiracy, including Gen Augusto Heleno and Gen Paulo Sergio Nogueira de Oliveira, have been ordered to begin serving their sentences. The situation gained international attention, with U.S. President Donald Trump commenting on the case, initially imposing tariffs on Brazilian exports, labeling it a witch hunt. However, the White House subsequently implemented tariff exceptions for Brazil's major exports. Trump expressed regret over Bolsonaro's arrest. This case represents a significant legal and political development in Brazil, marking the end of Bolsonaro's time in office and highlighting concerns about democratic stability. The arrest and sentencing underscore the serious consequences of attempting to undermine democratic processes. U.S. unveils America First. Global health strategy risks and criticisms mount. The United States has launched a new America First global health strategy, a significant departure from decades of international aid policy. This strategy prioritizes bilateral agreements with individual countries, aiming to shift responsibility for health systems development to recipient nations while decreasing U.S. assistance spending. The initiative, spearheaded by the State Department, involves negotiating compacts with 20 countries by December 31st, with ongoing discussions in an additional 50. A key component includes a $150 million agreement with an American drone company to expand access to medical supplies in 5 African nations. Critics express serious concerns about the strategy's potential negative impacts. Experts warn that the abrupt shift, coupled with prior cuts to U.S. foreign assistance, could exacerbate existing challenges within public health systems globally. The strategy's narrow focus, primarily on AIDS, malaria, tuberculosis, and infectious disease outbreaks, is also seen as a significant omission, neglecting vital areas such as immunization and reproductive health. Concerns center on the potential for reduced aid to lead to worsened health outcomes, particularly in fragile states where the absence of sustained U.S. support could prove detrimental. The strategy's emphasis on bilateral agreements raises questions about accountability and the ability of recipient countries to effectively manage and sustain health systems. Furthermore, the data sharing component, requiring 25 years of epidemiological data transmission, is viewed with skepticism, fearing it could benefit American pharmaceutical companies at the expense of global health needs. The shift towards a more transactional approach, reminiscent of criticisms leveled against China's aid practices, is also a point of contention. Despite these reservations, the State Department maintains that the strategy will incentivize countries to develop their own healthcare systems and foster connections with the U.S., creating business opportunities. The strategy includes pilot programs in Kenya, Zambia, and Nigeria, and agreements are structured like private sector contracts. Negotiations are ongoing with 20 countries, and the department anticipates reaching nearly all traditional health recipient countries, excluding South Africa, due to a strained political relationship. The strategy's implementation remains uncertain, with critics voicing fears of a risky and potentially destabilizing approach to global health. Canada's trade war with the USA Delicate Balancing Act. Canada's Prime Minister Mark Carney is adopting a cautious approach to trade negotiations with the United States, characterized by a deliberate lack of urgency. Following a recent pause in talks triggered by an Ontario advertisement featuring Ronald Reagan criticizing tariffs, Carney is considering a trip to Washington for the FIFA World Cup draw, a potential opportunity for a meeting with President Trump. Negotiations have stalled repeatedly, marked by a great deal of posturing on both sides, reflecting a strategy of appearing nonchalant to avoid appearing desperate. Despite the pauses, Canadian representatives are actively advocating for the country's interests in the U.S. Congress. The situation is particularly sensitive given that approximately 3/4 of Canada's exports are directed to the U.S., making the Canadian economy highly vulnerable to the ongoing trade dispute. The U.S. has imposed significant tariffs, including a 35% levy on most Canadian goods and specific sector-based tariffs on metals and automobiles. President Trump's recent walk-back of tariffs on food items and openness to reduce tariffs on imported metals, contingent on shifting production to the U.S., indicates a willingness to modify the approach. Canada's government is providing financial relief to sectors impacted by U.S. tariffs, a measure welcomed by aluminum producers grappling with initial tariff-related costs. However, the U.S. market's heavy reliance on imports of aluminum, with Americans depleting their stockpiles, creates a complex dynamic. Canadian officials are prioritizing doubling Canada's non-U.S. exports over the next decade, and Carney has undertaken a global investment campaign, including trips to the United Arab Emirates and the G20 summit in South Africa. The trade tensions are politically charged, particularly for President Trump ahead of the upcoming U.S. midterm elections, where economic concerns, including affordability, are a major factor. Concerns are particularly acute in Manitoba, where tariffs on heavy machinery have significantly impacted the local economy. Canada's strategy centers on patience, aiming to avoid a premature deal while continuing to advocate for its economic interests within the existing trade framework. Diplomatic row escalates over passenger detention in China. A recent incident at Shanghai airport has ignited a renewed diplomatic dispute between India and China following the detention of Indian citizen Pema Wangjam Thongdok. Thongdok, residing in the UK, was held for 18 hours after immigration officials flagged her passport, which listed her birthplace as Arunachal Pradesh, a region China claims is South Tibet. This event has exacerbated existing tensions along their disputed Himalayan border, specifically the line of actual control, a 440 km stretch. India strongly protested the detention, labeling it arbitrary and a violation of international air travel conventions and China's own regulations regarding visa-free transit. Foreign Ministry spokesperson Randir Jaiswal emphasized the lack of explanation from Chinese authorities. China, through spokesperson Mao Ning, defended the checks as lawful and non-abusive, asserting that Thongdok's rights were fully protected and no coercive measures were employed. China Eastern Airlines provided resting facilities and meals during her detention. The incident occurred amidst a period of cautious normalization of relations between the two nations, including the resumption of flight services and agreements on de-escalating border tensions. Recent efforts to improve ties followed previous clashes, including a significant confrontation in Tawang in 2022 and a complete breakdown in relations after a 2020 incident in the Galwan Valley. Chinese Foreign Minister Wang Yi's visit to Delhi in August, advocating for a partnership rather than adversarial relations, has been overshadowed by this latest development. Thong Dok's account of the situation, including being singled out and subjected to mocking remarks about her nationality, has garnered significant attention in India. She had previously traveled through Shanghai without issue. The core of the dispute remains China's claim over Arunachal Pradesh, a region India firmly considers an integral part of its territory. The incident underscores the continued sensitivity surrounding the border issue and the potential for further diplomatic friction, despite ongoing efforts to manage the relationship. The exchange highlights the deeply rooted historical and territorial disagreements that continue to shape the dynamic between the two Asian giants. EU Court upholds recognition of same-sex marriages across the bloc. The European Court of Justice issued a landmark ruling on Tuesday, declaring that same-sex marriages must be recognized throughout the European Union, effectively rebuking Poland for its previous refusal to acknowledge a marriage contracted between two of its citizens in Germany. The case involved a couple, identified only by their initials, who married in Berlin in 2018 and subsequently returned to Poland. They challenged the Polish Supreme Administrative Court's decision not to transcribe their German marriage certificate into the Polish registry. The court's judgment centered on the fundamental rights of EU citizens, specifically their freedom to move and reside within the bloc, and to enjoy a normal family life wherever they choose. It asserted that this right extends to couples who establish a family life in another member state, including through marriage. The ruling explicitly stated that the denial of recognition based solely on the nationality of the marriage location is a violation of these rights. Despite the court's decision, the ruling does not mandate that all EU member states legalize same-sex marriage domestically. However, it does prohibit discrimination against same-sex couples regarding the recognition of foreign marriages. This means that if a same-sex couple marries legally in one EU country, other member states are obligated to recognize that marriage. The case highlights ongoing tensions within Poland, a predominant Catholic nation, regarding LGBT equality. While the current government is working on legislation to regulate civil partnerships, including same-sex unions, resistance remains strong. President Karol Nawrocki has voiced opposition, threatening to veto any bill he deems a threat to the constitutionally protected status of traditional marriage. The court's decision represents a significant victory for LGBT rights within the EU, setting a precedent for the recognition of family relationships across borders. The Polish Supreme Administrative Court now faces the task of complying with the ruling, although the ultimate outcome remains subject to potential political challenges. Ukraine war. US and EU diverge on peace proposal. A significant divergence has emerged between the United States and the European Union regarding a proposed framework to conclude the war in Ukraine, with the US plan facing widespread criticism for its perceived bias towards Russia. The Trump administration's 28-point proposal, outlined in a draft, significantly differs from the European counter-proposal, which aligns more closely with Ukraine's objectives. Key distinctions center on territorial concessions, NATO expansion, and Ukraine's military capabilities. Concerning territory, the U.S. draft advocates for the de facto recognition of Luhansk, Donetsk, and occupied Crimea as Russian, alongside freezing Kherson and Zaporizhia along the existing line of contact. Conversely, the European draft mandates Ukraine's commitment not to reclaim occupied sovereign territory through military means, proposing negotiations starting from the line of contact. Regarding NATO expansion, the U.S. plan explicitly prohibits further NATO enlargement and requires Ukraine to forego membership. The European draft, however, removes this stipulation, stating that Ukraine's NATO accession depends on consensus among NATO members, acknowledging the current lack of agreement, but preserving the possibility. Furthermore, the U.S. draft limits Ukraine's armed forces to 600,000 personnel, while the European plan caps them at 800,000 during peacetime. Notably, neither draft addresses any limitations on Russia's substantially larger military. The U.S. draft also mandates Ukraine hold elections within 100 days of a sealed agreement, a timeframe deemed impractical by analysts. The European draft, in contrast, suggests elections should be held as soon as possible after an agreement. Several variations of the European text have been reported in international news outlets, differing from the Reuters version obtained. The U.S. plan has also undergone modifications, following discussions among top leaders in Geneva. U.S. Army Secretary Dan Driscoll recently held meetings with Russian officials in Abu Dhabi to discuss the proposed plan. The diverging approaches highlight the significant challenges in achieving a mutually acceptable resolution to the ongoing conflict, with differing priorities between the involved parties. Rare earth mining drives pollution and conflict in Mekong River Basin. A global surge in demand for rare earth minerals is causing severe environmental damage and fueling conflict within the Mekong River Basin, according to a new report by the Stimson Center. The river, vital for food production, water supply, and trade across 6 Southeast Asian countries, is being heavily polluted by unregulated mining operations, primarily driven by China's dominance in rare earth processing. The report maps over 400 unregulated mining sites across Myanmar, Laos and Cambodia, utilizing techniques such as alluvial mining, in situ leaching, and heap leaching, all of which employ hazardous chemicals like mercury and sodium cyanide. This activity is releasing toxins including arsenic, cyanide, and heavy metals directly into the river, threatening human health, wildlife, and agricultural lands. Communities reliant on the river for sustenance and economic activity are particularly vulnerable, with testing revealing high levels of contamination in water sources and impacting food production. Myanmar is the epicenter of the problem, accounting for nearly 80% of the identified unregulated mining activity. The country's ongoing civil war, coupled with rising gold prices and increased Chinese demand, has spurred a dramatic expansion of mining operations, facilitated by ethnic armed organizations and Chinese managers. These groups are exploiting poverty and conflict to extract rare earths, enriching themselves and supplying China with crucial materials used in everything from electric vehicles to smartphones. China's significant influence over Myanmar's military junta and its control of the global rare earth market further exacerbate the situation. The United States is responding by forging partnerships with Southeast Asian nations to diversify rare earth imports. While researchers urgently call for comprehensive river testing and stricter environmental standards to mitigate the damage, the Mekong River is increasingly viewed as a sacrifice zone, highlighting the potential ecological and social consequences of unchecked global demand for rare earth minerals. Concerns are growing about the long-term sustainability of the region's ecosystems and the well-being of millions of people dependent on the river's resources. The situation underscores the need for international cooperation and responsible mining practices to prevent further environmental degradation and social disruption.